Great. Yeah, Stephanie has already said my talk I want to give here is about the context of large language models. And I would like to discuss the importance of these contexts for the social and ethical implications that large language models have once they are used and once they are applied in our society. I think it's very important to not only look at large language models as a piece of technology and at their functions they bring with them, but also at the context in which they have been developed, which they depend on, and in which they are used. And that's what I would like to go into in this lecture. And I think it's thinking about the context is a bit of a paradoxical situation to start with, because on the one hand, from the technological point of view, large language models are said to be very context aware, have a high level of considering context of their data. That's what they distinguishes them from previous AI models. But on the other hand, LLMs are presented by the developers, by the firms that deploy them, in a way that is largely decontextualized. And I have tried to visualize this by help of all right, I think now the slides will go on. I have tried to visualize this with the first message that Sam Altman posted when ChatGPT, the most bespoke language models, was published, which was very slick, very short, and no big explanations, whatever. So not much context given. Just try talking with it here. And also the interface of the first ChatGPT was very slick and just one small box where you could enter your prompts and actually start talking with the model. So there was not much of context in that way. It was just the results of the model that were so astonishing. So in a way, ChatGPT came over us in the society like this monolithic block that suddenly appeared in the desert in Utah, where no one knows actually where it comes from and what it was intended for. People assume that it's kind of a piece of art, but others suggested it might have fallen down from some alien world or so, which is obviously not the case, but so this is just an image to show you how much out of context this technology is presented when it first appeared in that way. But of course, LLMs are not that kind of hermetic, mystic monolith, but they are part of technological development. They are part of our society. They are part of the field of research in AI. And thus, I would like to shed light on the various contexts in which LLMs are or are connected to. And I will start with context in terms of infrastructure, the infrastructural context. Second, I will talk about the role of information and the contextualization or the decontextualized nature of information in LLMs and what that means for their function and impact. And finally, the third part will be about the more social context of the invention and the impacts that LLMs have when they are applied and developed. And all of this I will do to make clear that considering the context is not only something that humans are very interested in contrast to technologies, but it also helps us to more realistically assess what potentials and pitfalls AI systems such as LLMs have, and to identify also where they can be used and what kind and how they can be improved. So, but first, a bit about my personal context. Stephanie has already talked about my work at the Office of Technology Assessment. We are advising the parliamentarians in all questions of technological change and scientific research and innovation. And in that function, I was asked at the beginning of last year, when ChatGPT was quite new, to not really assess this model, but to write a report about what it is in terms of the technology that is in it, the functionalities, but also the potential uses it can have and the potential impacts it has. Because the members of parliament of our committee were very interested in whether or not they should take action about it. The AI Act at that time was in the process of being redesigned to consider also its foundational models, which in the meantime had happened. And so in April, the report was published, and it gave a first impression of what various impacts we can expect from the large language model. I have tried to follow the field in the time since then. We also have follow-up projects considering specific fields like the role of LLMs in education or the role of AI in education. But on the one hand, it's quite hard to actually follow up this massive surge of information and new developments, etc. And on the other hand, I cannot talk here about my current work because it has not been published already, and the members of parliament always have the first right to hear our results. So we'll focus very much on what I have elaborated last year, and also draw lines where new developments have happened, and also go a bit more into the background that is responsible for the impacts that large language models have in terms of what the role of context and the context of information is, as you will see here. So I'm speaking here as a researcher of the KIT and in my personal profession, not as a representative of the Office of Technology Assessment. So let's start with the first aspect I would like to talk about, and that's the infrastructural context of large language models. I already showed you that when they were introduced, or when at least ChatGPT was introduced, there was not much talk about the history of GPT models that it relied on, or the history of AI research. But actually, once you think about it, you see that it's not as revolutionary as the GPT-3 was, or ChatGPT especially. It was actually also an evolutionary line of development, which goes back to the previous GPT model. The first one was published in 2018. It goes also back on the invention of the transformer architecture by Google engineers in 2017, which for the first time allowed this very efficient way of coping with massive amounts of unstructured data and uncoded data, and thus led the foundation for the GPT models. It also goes back to the attention mechanism, which allows the language model to consider not just the word in its closer context it deals with, but the token in a very wide and very complex context. I think Jan Ebert, who has also held a lecture in this lecture series, has talked more about these historical and technological background, so I will keep it short here. But you can see that there's actually a long history going back to even the Eliza chatbot, if you want to include the chatbot character of ChatGPT in this history, on which the current GPT models or the other large language models and the further development are based on, which they rely on. And as Christiane Floyd says here, to appreciate this current technological advance, we have to consider the progress during the last decades in all the various disciplines and see how they came together to establish what we can now see as perhaps one monolithic technology, but which is actually a whole network of interconnecting technologies and infrastructures. So here you have also a graphical representation of where the ChatGPT model especially is located in the field of AI research in general, deep learning, and the generative AI models. But you can also see that there's more. When we widen the perspective, we see that even AI research includes much more than just generative AI and large language models. Going back to symbolic AI, which is a bit in the background in the last years, but which is discussed as one possible way of improving large language models further beyond the obvious limitations these models have. So I think it's very helpful also to keep in mind that this whole rich history of AI research is the basis of the current models. And we should not forget the various ways that are possible in this research field for further development, although they might be a bit taken to the background by the current success of the large language models and of ChatGPT or GPT-4. When we talk about infrastructure, it also comes to mind that it's much more than just the algorithm of the model, and that's the huge technological infrastructure that is needed to bring the current models with their many billions of parameters to bring them about and to make them function. I would like to put this context of infrastructure into your consciousness to show that it's also connected with ecological but also economic concerns. And first, regarding the ecological concerns, people have pointed out that the energy and water consumption necessary for the training and also for the inference, so the running system, is quite high. There are various ways of calculating this, which differ a little bit, which has also to do that the data available is not really communicated transparently, which might change in the future, but people have also shown that the environmental aspects of AI systems, and especially large language models, are still not considered too relevant in research, but also in the political regulation. So there should be more consciousness and more awareness of the potential ecological effects this has. It also entails the raw materials needed for the technology components. We have heard about the scarceness of graphical processing units at the core technological infrastructure these models rely on in their training. And even if this might be okay, or this can be handled for individual models, which have I think the GPT models, people have calculated power consumption of 1.2 gigawatt hours in the training phase, which is which is quite a lot, but you can say, well, it's also quite a powerful model. But what we have seen in the meantime is a kind of explosion, or at least the exponential growth of the number of models, and also the growth of the models themselves still going on. They have even more parameters. We have heard that OpenAI has announced the next model, GPT-5, which is even bigger than GPT-4, to appear this summer, I think. And although there's some development in terms of making the models more efficient and using less energy, this is already, it's on the one hand, it's just one track of development, and on the other hand, there are so many more models, so many people wanting to use these models, that the energy concerns are still relevant for this field. But there's also an economic aspect to this, and people have questioned whether the enormous cost of training the model, and they need to be retrained after half a year or so, or at least fine-tuning has to be adapted, and also of running the system is actually justified by what their reward is when they are used. I cannot judge this. I don't have too many insights into that. I just can refer to it here. But I think it's in a way plausible that it's at the moment a kind of investment by the technology firms to bring this technology about. But it's questionable whether this huge effort needed for the training and the inference is actually paying off in a way for many people. And it's also the question whether this growth of the model can continue in that way, or whether we need rather a wholly new architecture of the models to get further progress. That's the argument of Gary Marcus. He has also pointed to this in 2022, but it's still relevant today, although we have not yet seen the wall that he's seen AI research is hitting in future. So so far for the infrastructure, but large language models also depend on a whole context of data, as you all know, I guess. And that's a point I would like to speak a bit more, as I think it's the point most interesting for data scientists, maybe. So let me start by the character of the information and how it is processed by humans versus the way it is processed by technologies such as large language models. So there's, although people argue that there's quite a similarity and we cannot see much difference in the Turing test mode where you don't know whom you are talking to from the results, the procession of information is quite different between humans and LLMs, as people have pointed to. And the main difference, I think, is the contextualized nature of information that we as humans process versus a kind of decontextualized nature. So when we sense something, when we see something, when we hear something, it's always a form of embodied information. We have our bodily senses, and the information is not picked up in a pure form, in an isolated form, but it's connected to many more sensorial inputs than the information itself. And that is different, of course, in LLMs, which pick up information mainly in text form, so in images, but still it's a very isolated form of information and not embodied in the same way with the physical aspects together, with the spatial aspects together, as we humans do. So we also process information because we need to do it. We need to keep our body running. We need to keep our lives running. So much of the procession of information is motivated by the needs we have as humans, as animals in a way, and that, of course, is also different for LLMs. They have been designed with a very general purpose as foundation models, and they don't have this this coupling with the basic needs like we humans do. And finally, all the information we pick up is always in a way socially mediated. We get information from other people. We are in relation to other people. We can we judge information by from whom we get it and whom is meant in this information. So all the information is very socially contextualized, which is of course also different in LLMs. They might have some abstract notions of actors derived from the text they have, but they don't have any social relations on their own. So they are a wholly abstract model in contrast to a really being in the world, as the anthropologists say, as we humans are. So here already you can see that the kind of information or the processing of information is very different with regard to the context it is embedded in between humans and LLMs. And this, that's the second point of the argument, this difference has a huge effect of what it does with the function such informations can have. For example, people have pointed out that when we deal with information, for example, in an academic context, it's very important to attribute it to a source. And this has the function that on the one hand, it's also an acknowledgement that it's not my work, the work of someone else. So it has to do with honesty, but it also has to do with trust. I have to trust the other person, and I have to evaluate the kind of information that I pick up from the reference. And it also has the function to open up a space of critique. So I do not take the information for granted, but I have to evaluate it. I have to question it. I can comment on it by referring to it, and I also can correct it by making things, stating things differently. And all of this cannot take place if the information is just picked up from the language model and produced as a result in the language model that is derived from its context. There's no link to a source, or at least no reliable link to a source. And so all these functions that come with this attribution cannot take place in the kind of information that we get as a result from a language model. And it's like Floyd says here, she compares it to ground meat, which is a crude picture, but I think it's I hope you get what she means. So you cannot tell where it comes from, and you don't have any transparency of how it was combined in the way it is presented to you. And that's a form of dead text, as she said, in contrast to a live text, which is full of the context of its origin. So that's a very important difference with regard to the results we get from LLMs, but also to the what we can do with that, or what we should do that with these results. So finally, no, it's not another aspect of the context of information is the large language models depend to a large degree on the data they are trained with and on the text corpuses that have been used for the training. And that has a kind of series of implications. One is that a problem is that we actually don't know for many large language models what kind of data has been used for their training. That has a role for the problem of bias. I will come back to a bit later. And also we have to ask what happens when there's no more new data that can be fed into these models. Do we have to stick with the current models, or will it even degenerate the quality of the models in what is called model collapse, because only artificially generated content can be fed into new models, and there's not enough new human content that can be fed into these models. But let me elaborate a bit on the role bias and how it is connected to the dependence of large language models on the information they are trained with. So bias means the misrepresentation of certain categories such as race, gender, religious orientation, etc., in the data already. And that can potentially lead to biased results. And that can, depending on for what the results are used, can eventually result in discrimination of people according to the categories. And I have brought some examples for bias. But first, let me say that indeed, it's quite well known that at least the earlier models had this problem of racializing stereotypes, gender, and religious bias. We have seen that the developers are aware of the problem and try to work against it with some success, but still the bias is inherent in the data sets, and it has to do with this dependence on the data set, because it's not this huge amount of data that goes into the training of an LLM cannot be curated in the same way for smaller models, for example. Okay, but let me show you some examples where this bias actually has or could have an impact when it is used. There have been cases in which police officers, or at least officials have used machine translated, for example, in immigration cases where people were applying for asylum, or where people were found to be suspect of criminal activity. And the machine translation, of course, makes some errors, and it makes these errors not in a systematic way, but it is biased towards languages which are not used that much, or towards languages that are not so easy for a machine to grasp and to deal with. And so there was a case of a Palestinian who was caught, and some machine translation produced an offense that he had said, but what he actually said was something very harmless. I think it was a greeting, and he was put in jail until this had been clarified. So it's not, well, it was not harmful in the end, but of course it's very annoying, and it's very concerning that it has to do with a special bias, and probably would not happen to people who speak English language, because that can be translated much easier, because there's more training material going into the LLMs in that language. Another example is, I haven't heard that this has actually had an impact already, but there's a study on dialect prejudice that is incorporated in large language models. That is, when large language models evaluate texts in certain languages or dialects, they can be asked to make judgments about the speaker. And these judgments are very racialized. And in the study, they have found that it's, I think it's a form of their racial stereotypes involved in the LLMs that go back to the 1950s, before the movement against racialism came up. And so when this is incorporated in the large language models, and large language models are used, for example, to assess student essays, and of course, people write in their own language, might have specific dialects, and then these prejudice goes into the assessment, it's very important that a human or a teacher or whoever has a look at the evaluation. It doesn't just take this as granted and perceive this as a valid assessment. Otherwise, you have indeed a form of discrimination incorporated in it. And finally, I said that the large language models depend on that, and it's actually not easy to adjust for such prejudices, as we have seen in the case of the model by Google, Gemini, where obviously people have tried by fine-tuning or whatever guardrails to train the model to not give biased pictures in that case. And here is a picture on the right-hand side of how Gemini imagines a pope. And that, of course, has nothing to do with our world we are in, but can be seen at the attempt to work against the bias that is inherent in the model data. And here, this attempt, of course, failed. So a final note I would like to send on the information context is that the decontextualized nature of information in these models goes even a bit further than just the choice of data and the potential bias in them. And people like here in Nguyen say that whatever data you choose and however you design it to be non-biased or whatever, they are always incomplete and they are always selective, and this always has an effect on what you can do with the data or what the data does once it is applied in for example, decision support systems or, as I said, teachers' evaluations or whatever. And that has to do with the nature of data or information, that not for all aspects of the huge social context we live in, data is available. It's always a very selective branch, and we don't choose any, even if a lot of data is available, we don't choose it because it has to be quantitative in nature to be processed, or it has to be standardized according to certain categories to be understood by people who are not aware of the situation. And in all these cases, the actual work with data always decontextualizes the information, and it's impossible to avoid this because it's in the pure nature of data, as Nguyen said. And so we can only try to recontextualize data, which is always a bit difficult, like work with qualitative data, work with different data sources, trying to enrich data. But as I said, still depending on a certain selection and categorization decision. And another way to deal with that is, of course, to be aware of it and to always know when we get results from a data processing system that already the data that went into the system has a specific selectivity and is decontextualized in that sense. And it's not perfect or the only model of the reality it was designed to depict. So it's a bit worsened the problem by what we call automation bias, and that is the tendency to think that whatever comes out of a machine is the truth or is objective, which of course it is not. But people tend to take it at that, and it's very important to be aware of that and not to fall for this automation bias. So the final context I would like to talk to, and I think I will keep this a bit shorter, is the more social context of the invention of such systems and the use of them, what impact they have on society. So here we have to ask who is developing the large language models in the first place. And I will only go through the list here to make clear what aspects are important here. One aspect is what kind of developing teams do we have? And many people point out that there's a male dominance in the field, in the Silicon Valley engineer field, and this has adverse effects on the diversity also of viewpoints represented in the large language model. It's so some people of users or some groups of users are more easily drawn to the systems because the developers had these guys in mind already, and others are more reluctant to use it because they feel not represented by the system. And that has to do with kind of the social selectivity of the developing teams. And we can also look at this from a global perspective and see that most of it is developed in the United States, also China and Western Europe. But the global south, for example, or the other countries are misrepresented in the development. And that, of course, has an effect in the way these systems are designed, the kind of problems they are designed for, etc. We also see that big tech firms dominate the development, and that can be a problem when they use the systems to further develop their market dominance. And we have also heard that these in the development, the human labor is distributed to people in poorer countries who work for less money. So it's exploiting global inequalities in the development and thus reinforcing them. We can also ask, when we ask about context of innovation, what happens with our data that goes into the systems. We see that data protection rules have often been neglected. ChatGPT has been, or OpenAI has been sued or blocked even by the Italian Data Protection Agency, and a number of open cases are at the moment discussed with the authorities, which concern the personal information, but which concern also the issue of copyright in the data that went into the large language model. But of course, also the data collected during the use is very important, and we could think of people establishing profiles of person and thus establishing or enhancing their market position by the help of amassing this data from the use. Finally, in the social context of large language model development, we can also ask who's responsible for the way they are developed. We have heard of the problems in the leadership structure of OpenAI, for example, which have shown that it's actually not a very reliable business environment where you would like to rely your own business ideas on. And it's also not necessarily very sustainable. I talked about the economic questions of the business models behind these large language models. But we also can ask who's responsible for the results. We heard that whatever comes out of a large language model can be true or false, can be correct or false. Correct. So someone has to take the responsibility, the developer or the deployer of the system. There have also been some legal cases discussing this, where an airline has been sued for a chatbot giving the wrong answers. And we have to ask who is responsible for the impact of the use, but also for the regulation. And here I've depicted some people who are involved in the development, in the discussion, in the regulation. But I think it's also important to keep in mind what time already depicted here very nicely when social media came up, that actually the end user is very important, and the way we use the system has also an effect of how they are developed and what other systems are offered. So with this, I'd like to come to an end, and yeah, to come back to the starting point of whether or not the LLMs are actually decontextualized. I think we have seen a number of contexts that are relevant for the technology of large language models, the technological, the informational, and the social context of their use. And I hope to have shown to you, or visualized to you, that to recognize that they are presented in a decontextualized way, and that there's actually a very rich context on which they rely on, but to which they relate to, and that recognizing this helps to more realistically assess what their potential are and what their potential impacts are, and thus to more realistically be able to decide what to use them for and in what way to develop them or improve them. So yeah, well, that's quite normal. LLMs are of course built by humans, and I think we can infer from this that they can also be controlled by humans. Although some people say they are out of control already, I think there are a lot of levers where we can try to get control of them. And some ways to do this can be to be aware of the importance of context in the function of LLMs, but also in the development. To build the necessary competencies. I know that large language models work against people building competencies because they have so many, or they can take so many tasks from us that we don't need to build the competencies our own. But I think it's very important to work against this and extend our competencies. And a way to do this can also be to work interdisciplinarily, not to stick to your own disciplinary context, but to look beyond your field, what others are doing, and to exchange with them. And in that way, to not only develop, but also use AI systems responsibly when you decide which system to choose, in what way, which guardrails to apply, and so on. So with that, thank you very much, and I look forward. We have some time for question and answers.
Thank you very much for the lecture. And now I open the floor for Q&As, and we already have 2 questions in the chat, so I would like to start with those ones. And maybe, Steffen, could you stop sharing the slides, because then I can see a little bit better the raised hands later on. Thank you.
All right, I hope this works.
Yeah, works well. So the first question is from Marek Simon, and he asked whether you have a reference on the energy consumption of running an LLM in contrast to training the LLM, which is obviously computationally very expensive, because he says Roda et al. Seems to only relate to training.
Yeah, I think I would have to look this up. I know that this Roda has worked on both aspects. I'm not sure if this, the reference I've given here, which is from the Sustain AI project, already covers both aspects, but